Good evening and welcome to the first edition of this year's Crossroads of Ideas series. We're delighted to see all of you here. My name is Laura Heisler. I'm the Director of Programming for the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation and for the Mortgage Institute for Research, which are two of the three organizations that are based in this building and that have come together to create this Crossroads of Ideas series. This year we are delighted to be partnering throughout the entire semester on three sessions with the Sociology 496 Wisconsin Idea Past and Present course. And we're just really thrilled to be working with Patrick and Eric and Gwen on bringing you this series in conjunction with the Crossroads. The three of us based in this building really feel that the Wisconsin Idea is the reason that we have this building and that we have this series, and it was just a wonderful opportunity to be able to partner with our colleagues in sociology. So we're really grateful for that and grateful for you for coming. So can I see a show of hands for people for whom this is your first Crossroads of Ideas talk? Wonderful. Well, welcome. I do want to give you a little bit of information about what's coming the rest of the semester. We hold these talks, the Crossroads talks, once a month during the academic year on a Tuesday night. And this year, as I mentioned, for three of the sessions in the fall, we'll be partnering with the Sociology 496 class. The one exception is that we're having a special presentation next week in conjunction with UW Communications and their Science Writer in Residence program. So next week we have a Command Performance Crossroads talk by Ed Young from The Atlantic and Liz Neely, who's the CEO of something called Story Collider in New York. And they'll be talking about science writing and storytelling. The other sessions this semester are with Meg Gaines from the law school on the Center for Patient Partnerships, and then rounding out this semester on the path from basic to applied research with Paula Niedenthal. So make a note of these. If you got an email for this session or are on the distribution list for the class, you'll find out about this. If you didn't and you would like to, we have a sign-up sheet outside the door. And also, if you are taking this class for credit, whether it's 1 or 3 credits, please do sign the sign-up sheet outside the door and put a star by your name, and that will tell us that you're one of the students and will convey that you were here to the organizers of the course. A couple more things I want to mention. Our speaker tonight indicated that she would welcome questions throughout her talk. So she'll help field those. We do have mic runners because we record these sessions. We'd love it if you would wait for one of the mics to get to you. That way your question can be on the tape. And then we'll also have some questions at the end. So we are going to go all the way up until 8:15 and then round things out then. And I'm guessing that Pam might be willing to stick around for a couple additional questions if you want to come up. But do have the expectation that we're going to be here engaged with our speaker till about 8:15. So with that, let me just give a little background on Pam Herd. She is a professor of public affairs and sociology and the director for the Center for the Demography of Health and Aging and the principal investigator of the Wisconsin Longitudinal Study. Her research interests are in the areas of aging, health, biodemography, and survey research. Broadly, she's interested in how social conditions, ranging from social relationships to educational attainment, influence health. Recent work has begun to explore how these social processes get under the skin to influence health. In particular, her work has expanded to include the role of genetics and the gut microbiome in explaining the link between social conditions and health. Her research has been published in journals such as Social Forces, the Journal of Politics, American Journal of Public Health, Journals of Gerontology, and Journal of Health and Social Behavior. She's a fellow of the Gerontological Society of America and a member of the National Academy of Social Insurance. She's also currently a member of the Board of Overseers for the Panel Study of Income Dynamics and the chair of the Board of Overseers for the General Social Survey. Thank you very much for your attention, and please join me in welcoming Pam Herd.
Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm really excited to talk to you about the Wisconsin Longitudinal Study. Let me just get my slides going here. All right, there we go. So I'll just sort of take a step back and just try to give you a sense about what I'm going to cover tonight generally. So I sort of have I don't know, maybe 3 goals is the way to think about it in terms of what I'm covering tonight. The first is really to talk about the Wisconsin Longitudinal Study, this project that has been tracking 1 in 3 Wisconsin high school graduates from the class of 1957, and we've been tracking them since 1957, and they're currently in their mid-70s. As well as we've expanded the study to include siblings of those graduates. So the first is to sort of generally give an overview of that project, the things that we've learned from that project. And second, and really relatedly, and I think why they wanted me to talk to you all tonight, is why it's just this really incredible example of the Wisconsin idea in practice, right? So the Wisconsin idea is really about how we think about the university as a kind of mechanism to provide a broader amount of service in terms of our research, both on the state of Wisconsin, increasingly nationally and internationally. Oh, I'm sorry, this happens sometimes. Give me 1 second, my contact lens just popped out. It's surprising how often this happens. Okay, back at it. So the broader idea, right, of the Wisconsin idea is about the way that the university engages with both the state of Wisconsin, nationally and even internationally, and especially in terms of how our research can help improve a broad range and broadly in terms of the human condition, right? Everything from basic research to health to policy research as well. But the cool thing about the Wisconsin Longitudinal Study is the degree to which it's truly a collaborative, iterative process. So yes, this is a study that we run here, and thousands of researchers all over the world use these data, but ultimately it couldn't happen without the participation of this cohort of folks who we've been tracking their whole lives. So it's this really kind of wonderful collaborative process that we believe has had an important influence on improving or sort of expanding what we understand about a range of different things across people's lives that shape well-being, financial well-being, health, all of those things. But the final thing that I want to do here is just provide, in a way, the Wisconsin Longitudinal Study is a really nice example of kind of a broader way that social scientists in particular approach research. And so partly what I'm going to be doing here throughout the talk is giving some clues about that, sort of how this fits into a broader way in which social scientists engage in research. And I think there's some really neat elements of it. And I'm going to tip my hat a little bit ahead of time to say that while I say social scientists, increasingly this is a project that is not just used by social scientists, but that's used by geneticists, that's used by bacteriologists, evolutionary biologists, health researchers. So increasingly the way that social scientists like to do work or like to do research is something that has been picked up and benefited disciplines well outside of social science. Okay, so how did this study start? So the study itself, essentially the original sample, was all Wisconsin high school graduates of the class of 1957. Now, the reason that this study started has its root in the Sputnik era. So the basic idea was, at the time, there was massive amounts of expansion in terms of higher ed in the US. And Wisconsin was kind of on the forefront in terms of thinking about how to do that well, and how to do that in a public university system. But to help them do that, they wanted to have some base knowledge of who these students were who might be entering these sort of expansion of the public university in Wisconsin. So they fielded this huge study to try to help them understand a little bit better. So in terms of, if you're thinking about what has this study done, well, the very first thing it did actually was help ground some knowledge to think about the expansion of public higher ed in Wisconsin. This is an example, actually, or a page from the very first study, or the very first survey that went to Wisconsin high school seniors okay? And this is just one page of it, but it just asked a wide array of different questions of folks. So, you know, it asked them about their plans, whether they were gonna go right to college or whether they're gonna start working or enter the military. It asked them questions about the kind of classes that they were taking. It asked them questions about their attitudes about school. Did they like school? Did they not like school? So it was a whole range of different questions, including things like questions around affordability, actually, which is obviously college affordability continues to be a real issue today. But even in the survey, there were lots of questions about whether or not people felt affordability would influence whether or not they could go on to college. Now, I want to give a little primer here on sample selection, okay? So when we talk about a project like this, it's really important that we understand the sample that's included in the project. And it's really important that we understand how that sample is picked. So in studies like this, the Wisconsin Longitudinal is not the only study like this. There are hundreds of other studies at this point around the country and around the world like this. We want to think very carefully about what's our sample frame. So the sample frame for this project, as you already know, right, is all Wisconsin high school seniors of the class of 1957. And then we want to think about something we call random draws. So the idea is, if you want a representative picture of that sample frame, so we wanted a representative picture of all 1957 Wisconsin high school graduates, but you don't want to interview everyone, because you can't, because it's not feasible, you do a random draw. And the random draw is really, really important, because if you don't do a random draw, you're not really sure what you have is representative. So for example, if looking at all of you, I thought, okay, here, my sample frame is this room, and then I say, okay, I only want to survey a quarter of this room. And if I just picked everyone in the front, say 2 rows or something, that would be a problem, because there's certain reasons why the people in the front 2 rows are sitting in the front 2 rows, right? For me, it's my eyesight, so I sit in the front 2 rows because I can't see. For others, you know, but there's a reason why. So you'd never want to do that. What we'd want to do is some sort of random draw. There's lots of ways this happens in different kinds of surveys. So the classic approach, which is a little bit harder now because of cell phones and a range of different things, but the classic approach is you do a random draw. Like if you wanted a national probability sample, you simply take all, like they have these compendiums of people's phone numbers, and you do random draws of phone numbers. And that's how you know you end up with a random sample. It's as random as you can get, basically. The problem when you don't do that, and the problem when you do selection is Huey beats Truman, right? Well, of course, Huey did not beat Truman. But the way that they had done the polling in this period was not these sort of random draws. They did something slightly different, what I'm not going to get into, but it was not a random draw. They just sort of picked out certain segments of the population. And as a result, even though they had huge samples for this, so you know, hundreds of thousands of people actually that comprised some of these polling data at the time, it didn't matter because it wasn't representative. And so everyone thought that Huey beat Truman, which was not what happened. And I won't get into to recent polling from the recent presidential election, but it is a real challenge ensuring, right? Like you intuitively, I bet you guys understand that, right? Like you got to have a representative sample or you're not going to be really sure. Now, we have grown to like to talk about our sample as the Happy Days cohort. Now, most of you in the room probably remember the 1970s series Happy Days, right? But this is the cohort. These are, well, that was a fictional cohort, obviously. But 1957 high school grads, of course, these guys were based in Milwaukee. But the way to understand kind of the sample frame is the following. The Fonz was not included in the sample frame, right? And the Fonz wasn't in there because he didn't graduate from high school. Apparently he got a GED in season 4, but he didn't get a high school degree, so he's not in the sample. So then we have those 3 remaining individuals who are in our sample, okay? And that was what formed the basis of the project. But at the time, Bill Sewell, who started this study, Bill Sewell was a former professor of sociology here. He was actually a chancellor in the late 60s here. And he was the one who started this study. And what he did was, because he couldn't afford to interview, and you don't actually need to, you can do random sample draws like this, as long as it's representative in a random draw. He decided to do 1/3 basically of this sample. And so there we go. We ended up with Richie. So our random 1/3, the original sample size was just over 10,300. Now, as I sort of alluded to at the beginning, we did actually bring in the siblings of this graduate sample. So for every sort of eligible graduate, essentially meaning anyone who had a sibling, and a sibling who we could convince to participate in the project, became included in our project. We also ask a lot of questions about people's families. So even though the focal point are the graduate and the sibling of the graduate, we ask a ton of questions about their kids and about their parents, and about even other siblings within their family. But the primary sample is this graduate and sibling. Okay. Now, of course, the sample is aging. Ron Howard is aged. If anyone was a close observer, I've clearly aged since that photo. That was okay. So the survey years, though. So the story about this is that these surveys ended up in a basement in Bascom Hall, the original full sample. They were about to get thrown out. And someone mentioned, because they knew Bill Sewell was interested in kind of trying to understand what predicted who went to college and what predicted why certain people got certain kinds of jobs, someone mentioned it to him and said, you might be interested in this. And so Bill Sewell was indeed interested in that and ended up in the basement and then ended up the study. Now, so that first round was in 1957, and then the first survey that Sewell conducted was in 1964, where he actually sent out postcards to the parents of those original graduates. Okay, so he followed up with the parents to try to figure out what they were doing. Were they in college? Were they working? So on and so forth. The response rate was well over 90%. So most parents actually did respond and tell him where these guys were. And then in 1975, they followed up with a big telephone survey. 1977, we started interviewing siblings, a smaller sample than what we ended up with, but the initial attempt to do that. And then in the early 90s and going forward, those are fairly full samples of both the graduates and the siblings. Okay, so how many of you in this room have ever participated in a survey? I'm just curious. Oh, okay. So the thing is, surveys are really different. So some surveys, and I'm sure many of you get them, you get those phone calls and it's a commercial survey, right? Like they're trying to sell something, and so they want to understand your opinions about what they're trying to sell. I expect that a bunch of you have also just got polling surveys around elections. I mean, we're in Wisconsin, we get a lot of those, right? We get a lot of polling surveys. The interview for a project like this is really different, in part because we're looking for a lot of varied information on the participants in our project. So one actually might argue that we come across as if we're a little bit nosy, because we ask people about every aspect of their lives, basically. So we ask them about their health, we ask them about their families, we ask them about their kids specifically, we ask them about their social lives. We ask them about pretty much every kind of topic you could cover. And I'll talk in a minute about why we do that, why it's so comprehensive. But what's important to understand is how patient our participants are in this project. So the last survey, now this varies. So some surveys we've done over the phone over the years, some surveys have been by mail. The last one that we did in the around 2011 to 2013, we actually went to people's homes or we met them somewhere else. And we actually did up to a three-hour interview. And we did all of those questions, plus we asked people to do things to assess things like physical functioning. So we asked people to like walk across a room or stand up and sit down or those sorts of things as well. We also did a lot of sort of tests of what we refer to as like cognitive assessments, just to sort of test cognitive functioning as people age. So we did a wide array of activities. Now, I do want to say that all of us on the staff here, and I meant to do it at the beginning and I didn't, Carol Rowan, who is our project director, is in here in the back. And I think I see Stan in the audience as well. So all of our, Carrie Ann, yeah, Carrie Ann is here. Carrie Ann is our liaison with the UW Survey Center, who actually runs the survey for us. But what I started to say is basically that it's a very long interview. We all actually do it ourselves. So the interviewers will come and do me. And I have to say that when I did the practice one, I was very tired by the end of it. But so we ask a lot of our participants. And as I've already mentioned, we really cover every aspect of people's lives. And so this is just to give you a general overview of the kinds of things: social family, educational histories, employment, job characteristics. We ask a lot about people's children, their physical and mental health, income and wealth, the cognitive performance data, and those sorts of features. Now, I want to take a step back here and sort of say, because it sounds like, right, it's everything. Right? On some level, what we're asking about is everything. And that's sort of true. So one way to think about this is very broadly the goals of the project, especially at this point, and I'll talk about how they've changed over time, but especially at this point, the goal of the project is to help us understand what things help determine economic, psychological, and physical well-being over the life course. So how do things that go on in people's childhood, how do work lives or certain kinds of occupations influence how people age? How does retirement, or when people retire, influence the kind of how does retirement influence people's well-being after retirement, basically? So when do people retire, and how does that influence their well-being? All kinds of questions along those dimensions. But again, what I think it's important to really understand here is that there are actually thousands of researchers who use these data. And I'm going to talk about some examples of different kinds of findings that people have generated from these data, from fields really as diverse as microbiology and evolutionary biology to the more basic social sciences, who traditionally use these data, like sociology, psychology, and economics. And the one thing that's really kind of, I think, special about this project, and one thing that had an influence in terms of a lot of other projects like it, was the extent to which we share our data. Now, what do I mean by that, okay? So the data itself, it's really important that the data be kept, we talk about it as sort of anonymized, that we really ensure people's confidentiality, and we have a range of different ways to do that. And we're incredibly careful about that. But the idea is to maximize the value of these data, to maximize the value of the contributions that all these participants have made over the course of their lives. We want as many people to use it as possible, right? Like, we want as much as we can to kind of get out of it. Historically, though, especially still in the 70s when this project was started, people did not share their data. It's a lot of work. So on my part, it's a lot of work to kind of, our funding comes primarily from the National Institutes of Health. So there's a lot of work that goes in doing that and collecting the data. And people could get kind of territorial about it. They didn't want to share it. They wanted to use it to sort of further their own scientific careers. But the Wisconsin Longitudinal study was one of the first studies to really rethink that and really rethink, is this what's best for science? Is the best way to move science forward that we're territorial about the data that we collect, and we're really focused on sort of pursuing our own specific research questions that we're interested in? Or can we think about this as a collective good, as a public good? And that's the model that we went with. And increasingly, actually, the rest of the social sciences ended up moving that way. And increasingly in the basic and health sciences, they're also moving in that direction. That no, you share these data, you try to maximize the contribution that the people participating in these studies have made, as well as the people, as well as the fact that a lot of these are publicly funded data, right? So I wanted to really emphasize, because that's a really important contribution that the project has made. Now, just to give you a little sense here of like who's in our study, I'm going to talk about just a couple of brief things before I talk about the data itself. So first of all, right, it's important to remember that the graduates themselves were all high school grads. There's variance in terms of the fraction of people who went on and got post-secondary schooling and the type of post-secondary schooling, but they're all high school grads. The siblings, there's a little bit of variation, but on average, our sample is better educated than, say, the average person in this cohort in general, right? So at the time, approximately 75 to 80% of people finished high school. So we're only capturing those 75 to 80% of people. We also talk a lot about the fact that we have a very married sample is a term that maybe not many people throw around, but we do. And so you can just sort of see from the distribution here, right? Across time, large fractions of our sample are married, have been continuously married. It's also the case that our sample, in part because our sample is slightly better educated than on average, also tends to have actually slightly better health than you would expect sort of at any given age, quite bluntly. Now, I'm just picking out 2 years here. I'm picking out 2004 and 2011, when folks were in their, say, mid-60s and then in their early 70s. But basically, that's just showing you, about a quarter of people were reporting their health as excellent, a third, or nearly 40%, reporting their health as very good, and so on and so forth. This question, by the way, it seems really basic, right? Like, you could ask, and we do ask people much, much more specific questions about their health. But the interesting thing is, this turns out to be a question that's a really good predictor of mortality. So if you compare studies that have compared this question versus a doctor's assessment, this does a better job than a doctor's assessment. So there you go. It's your fun fact for the night. So the next time you answer this a survey, be sure to say excellent, right? I'm kidding. I really didn't. Tainting my results here. Okay, so one thing, and I was just thinking in my head, Bob Hauser would be chastising me if he heard me do that. So before I took over this project in 2010, approximately. Prior to that, as I already mentioned, Bill Sewell was the first PI. The second PI after Bill Sewell was Bob Hauser, and he really ran this project from the mid-70s up until 2010. And so some of the work that I'm going to be talking about here is really rooted in Bill Sewell's research and also Bob Hauser's research as well. Okay, so when the project started, no one was actually thinking about things that we're interested in now, like health. Okay, what people were interested in at the time was really understanding why some kids went on to college and some kids didn't. Why some people had certain kinds of occupations or jobs or earnings and other people didn't. It was a very sort of straightforward goal. Now, at this time, I think some of the questions or some of the insights and findings from the study might seem obvious, but at the time they were not. At the time, they were really not, because prior to this period, the kinds of people who went to college were what we would say is very select. It's a very small fraction of people, generally, quite bluntly, from very high socioeconomic status and wealthy families. It was sort of during this period where you had this big transition, where actually now a lot of people were starting to go to college, and we weren't really quite sure, like, why some people ended up there and other people didn't. And some of the really interesting findings, and again, it seems obvious now, but this was not obvious at the time. Some of the central things that really mattered in terms of understanding who went on to college, for example, were things like parental encouragement, the amount of encouragement that people got, their parents' educational attainment and parents' income. Those things did still matter. But also people's own individual aspirations. How badly did they want this? That mattered a lot as well. And these findings, there's a term for it, it's called the Wisconsin Status Attainment Model, but it really shaped all of the sort of early years of what we understood about these processes. These kinds of findings were replicated in a lot of other projects, sort of like WLS, but not like WLS, and that on different samples, for example, different groups of people, so maybe a national sample, for example. But these findings have really basically held up over time. Since then, there's been a lot of ongoing work to try to understand different things that help to clarify, like, for example, why some people earn more. So this is a finding from a group of economists, actually, who studied personality. Now, mean people is, a journalistic speak for a personality term, agreeableness. But basically, people who were somewhat less agreeable did tend to earn more, it turns out. Another example is, this is an interesting one, is we found that people who were heavier in high school had lower earnings across the rest of their lives. Now, this is a finding that's been replicated in other kinds of data as well, that there's a relationship. It's actually more so for women than for men. So weight is a bigger predictor of earnings for women than for men. And there's, I think the argument is, or what people think is going on, is that there's a discriminatory mechanism going on to explain the gender difference. But that was something that came out a few years back. The other, and now I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about this. So another really interesting paper in terms of understanding earnings over the long run was focused on, of course, popular kids here. But the idea was, one thing that we did was go back and we got a hold of yearbooks from the class of 1957. And what we did was we used those yearbooks to get some additional information, basically. So one thing that we were interested in was, for example, the kinds of activities that people participated in. I'm going to talk about that more in a minute in relationship to another project. But just to set the groundwork here, we came up with a lot of different ways to kind of try to figure out sort of popularity. And some of the data was from yearbooks, and some of the data was from self-reported friends that people labeled. But the gist was they did find the kids with more social connections did tend to earn more. And this is sort of a long-standing finding in the social sciences more generally. If there's one sort of thing that social scientists have shown sort of over and over again in slightly different ways, is that social relationships really matter. Okay? Social relationships matter for people's psychological well-being. They matter for their physical well-being. They matter in very particular ways for health outcomes, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But this is sort of an example of just one, this is just one example of that, basically. And one of the really cool things about these data is that we have a lot of information on people's social relationships. So this is one thing that's really nice for us to be able to explore in the data and really look at how it influences people over their whole lives, not just sort of at one point in time. So as the study has moved on over time, what we've become interested in learning about has changed. So this is sort of one of the interesting things about projects like this. So currently, there are very few projects in the United States that have tracked a sample of individuals for this long. So there's a couple of other ones, but they're much, much smaller, and they're less representative than this particular sample. The only comparable ones would be some studies in the UK that have tracked people over their whole lives. But there's one commonality across all these studies, is what they start out being interested in learning changes as people's lives change, right? So we started out being really interested in educational attainment, and then gradually, once people hit their 30s and 40s, people started getting more interested in, like, okay, yeah, but why do some people have kids and others don't? Why do some women go into the workforce and others don't? So those kinds of questions. So in midlife, in the 1970s survey, that was driving a lot of the interest. What was shaping people's careers? What was shaping people's earnings? Those sorts of things. But as time has gone on and people's lives have changed, we've started asking a lot more questions about health in later life. So this is an example of, I think, a nice example of how the data gets used in ways that kind of bridge the full lifetime of data. So we have data on people's academic performance in high school, okay? And we do find, and this is another really particular and really interesting thing about this project, is that we do have this data on people's academic performance, which is really unusual. Most projects, especially with this span of sort of the life, do not have data on academic performance. What they have is sort of just attainment. So you have a sense of like whether people got college degrees or not, but you don't really know how well they performed academically, for example, in high school. And it turns out that really matters, especially for women, in terms of kind of understanding a range of different outcomes. So in this case, this project was really just focused on general health. And we found that even when you controlled, so even when you looked within people who went to college, okay, they both got, like two people, they both got college degrees. The person who had performed better academically in high school actually had better health. And other projects have showed that people live longer as well. So it's a really interesting and kind of novel use of these data. And it's turned out to be something that then in turn, other projects have started to try to incorporate. Because it was clear from this that we were starting to see some really interesting relationships that people hadn't even sort of thought to look for. This is one of my favorite kind of findings. We're in Wisconsin. So there's the benefit of having this, there's a lot of benefits to having a lifetime of data on people. And so I'm just going to give you one example of this. So there is a lot of research that has found that there is a relationship between cognitive functioning and alcohol consumption. And that is that people with who drink more, who consume more alcohol, especially when you look at people in their 50s and 60s, tend to have better cognitive functioning. Well, that sounds great, doesn't it? Here's the problem, though. It turns out that when you use data from the Wisconsin Longitudinal study, because apparently from about the 1930s into the 1960s, high school students in Wisconsin all had to take, it's called the Henman-Nelson Ability Test, and it's essentially like an IQ score. It's a rough proxy for what an IQ score is, and all students had to take them, and that's included in our data, okay? So what we were able to show, though, sure, yeah, there is this relationship between later life cognitive functioning and alcohol consumption. But it's not because drinking was making people function better, unfortunately. It was simply because people with higher levels of cognitive functioning, even in their adolescence, were just more likely to drink and more likely to drink more. Now, draw from that what you will. But it's a really nice example of kind of the huge advantages to these data. And what I'll say is, and I'm going to give another example, as we sort of try to understand changes in cognitive functioning as people age, having that original, for reasons like this, having that original cognitive functioning score when people were adolescents is actually really, really valuable. It's a really valuable thing in these data, and it's really unusual. There are very, very few projects like this that have that. Okay, so this is another recent study that came out, and this is, I'm going to harken back to our yearbook data again. So one thing that we were able to do with those yearbooks was, for example, figured out who played football in high school, because of all those photos in people's yearbooks, right? The track that linked you to particular activities. And so there were some researchers from Harvard Medical School who got a hold of our data and were interested in trying to understand whether or not there was any long-term relationships between having participated in high school football and cognitive functioning in later life. And again, one of the reasons that they were really able to do this effectively was because of all that information we had on people when they were in high school, right? Because some people played, I mean, the difference between people who played football among men, there are real differences in who played football and who didn't. And some of those might lead you to think one thing if you're looking at cognitive functioning in later life that might not be a real relationship there, basically. So all of that early data really, really helped in trying to sort this out. And they actually did not find a relationship between having participated in football and any kinds of issues in people's 60s and early 70s. Now, I'm sure if for anyone who's following this, there's sort of this is still an ongoing area of work. I think one of the things that they pointed to was people played football differently in that era in terms of helmets and the brute force, right? There might be some people in this room who could tell me better than I can. But basically, there wasn't the same level of brute force that might lead to the kind of brain trauma that we see today. And we were also looking people playing football in high school, where a lot of the evidence is increasingly about younger adolescents, like kids 10, 11, 12. But anyway, this is a really nice example and use of these data. Another kind of particular area of research, this is Debbie Carr, who is currently at Boston University, but who spent a good chunk of her career here at Wisconsin, has done a lot of work on trying to understand the way that people make what we refer to as end-of-life decisions. So do people have living wills? Do people have wills? All those kinds of choices around end-of-life decision making. And she participated in a project run by the National Academies of Sciences that used a ton of work from WLS to try to help policymakers understand a little bit better about, for example, why some people prepare and do living wills and other people don't, or why some people have wills or prepare wills and other people don't. And it's really interesting, actually. So one particular finding in this, or one particular thing that she found in this project was experiencing the loss of someone close to you increased the probability that you would do some of these things. So it was basically, the argument was, it was about experience. It was watching someone else experience something and feeling like if someone kind of engaged in these kinds of activities, it would help them and their family. So that's just one example. The other kind of fun one, this is a Debbie Carr again, actually. She had a book that came out a few years back called Making Up with Mom. And what she was interested in is sort of understanding the generation gap. So the difference between this cohort, the mothers in this cohort, and the fathers in this cohort, and their kids. Were there big generational differences between these two groups in terms of how they got along? And what she found was actually quite a bit of similarity. So most kids and their parents had fairly similar outlooks on life. But she did find some kind of interesting, and given where I am in my life, I thought some sort of funny findings from this project was, this was essentially mothers' views of their daughters, which was that on the one hand, they really appreciated the fact that their daughters were more likely, for example, to be, say, working full-time or engaged in a career than they were, but they also saw that their daughters' lives were fairly chaotic. So there's Tina Fey under the table. I'll fess up here that literally 2 hours before I was supposed to be here, the babysitter canceled and my husband's out of town. So I almost literally had my two kids in the corner watching their iPads, which I guess would have been a nice visualization of this. You can pick up on this. There's a whole body of work about this, about how the kids of this cohort, basically, we talk about the sort of extension of childhood or the extension of adolescence, that people are sometimes going to school actually a little bit later than their parents did, even college, but more importantly, a little bit slower to move out of the house, a little bit slower to get married, maybe even a little bit slower to get a job. So that's some of what she was picking up in the project, was that there was this sense of that their kids were, say, a little bit more behind than where they were at a similar age, basically. Now, some of what we're doing now, so what I want to be clear is that kind of work is still ongoing. There's a lot of people still really interested in understanding, especially because we have people's earnings, say, over their entire lives. There are a lot of ongoing projects still trying to understand, why some people earn more than others, or more generally, why some people end up happier later in life than others. And there's tons of that kind of work going on. But we also kind of got interested, and this is harkening back to surveys in general, as surveys in general started to include a lot more information on health, which really started in the 1990s. This was something that changed in the 1990s. People started, the way that we kind of started off was just sort of asking people questions, which, as I already mentioned, is not a bad way to understand people's health, which was simply ask, how would you rate your health? You ask people what kinds of chronic conditions they have. Do you have diabetes? Do you have heart disease? Things like that. But increasingly, changes in technology allowed us to go even deeper than that, or are allowing us to go even deeper than that. So rather than just simply asking people, we can also now collect certain kinds of biological data that can help us understand a little bit better those basic biological relationships. So I'm going to give you a few examples. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what this is like for participants. So in 2007, the Wisconsin team mailed out these envelopes with what's called an origin kit. And it's like a little test tube. And we asked people to provide us with some saliva in that test tube so that we could collect genetic data on individuals, okay? So that we could kind of understand people's underlying genetics. Now, I can't emphasize enough how rapidly this has changed, even since 2007. So when we started in 2007, just to give you an example, you could kind of get from those data what are called SNPs, a few different kinds of SNPs. So single nucleotide polymorphisms, and all they are basically genetic variants. It's like normal genetic variation, okay? Normal genetic variation within the population, like what might determine eye color, for example. And we could spend, maybe, I don't know, $70 or $80, up to $150 per sample to get like maybe 60 of those variants. That's what we could identify. And there were some, they were still really learning at this point. We didn't actually really have any clue what variants would link to what outcome. There were a lot of hypotheses, there were a lot of small studies, there were a lot of animal studies that sort of clued us into what we might look at. But the truth is, we're still pretty in the dark. And it was still in a period where a lot of people really thought that there was gonna be a single gene for a single outcome. Right? We were going to find the gene for heart disease. We were going to find the gene for cancer. And that, over the past 10 years, has not panned out at all, actually. With a few exceptions, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, right? Like there is a breast cancer gene, a BRCA gene. There are a few. But by and large, what's become really clear is that actually there's a ton of genetic invariants involved in any kind of outcome, be it a health outcome, like cardiovascular disease or Alzheimer's disease, for example, or be it a behavioral outcome, like educational attainment, okay? So thousands of genes. The problem was, though, in 2007, if you wanted to do that, if we wanted to kind of assay for, essentially a million variants, which is kind of sort of what you need to do, or pretty close to what you need to do, it would have cost at that time, I think, somewhere around $8,000 or $9,000 per sample, right? That wasn't going to happen. Okay, so but between 2007 and when we finally were able to do that in approximately 2015, 16, essentially, it dropped from that price. And well, now, I'll tell you now, it's like $60, $70 a sample, right? So the technological change has been incredible in terms of what it's allowed people to learn. And that cost reduction, right, has had a big influence on people being able to figure out some of these things I'm talking about, right? Like being able to figure out the fact that, gosh, it's not one gene. It's a lot of different genetic variants that are going to influence any one outcome, okay? So that's been a huge change. And the kinds of projects that we tend to participate in are very varied with these data. So I'll talk about a couple. For example, we are going to participate in a project that looks at genetic variation in physical functioning. Okay, so it'll in the next year or so, we'll participate in that project. And what people will do, the person who will run that study actually, will not only use WLS data, but they'll use data from a whole range of different projects to try to look for whether or not there are associations between particular genetic variants and physical functioning. The term that some people use are something called frailty, for example. But the idea is you just try to understand, is there any kind of genetic explanation here for why some people can walk a little bit faster at a certain age than others, for example, okay? So that would be one type of study that we participate in. Another type of study that we participate in, and now I'll talk about this in a minute, is actually the relationship between genes and educational attainment. Okay, so we already know that there is a relationship between genetics and educational attainment. Okay, so genetics plays some role. Okay, it depends on who you believe. So in the past, the way that people thought about this was using twin studies. The problem with twin studies, or one trick about them, is there are these unusual samples, because twins are sometimes unusual. But based on those, the idea is there was clearly some kind of genetic variation that helped explain educational attainment. But a lack of clarity and a kind of a lack, most importantly from the perspective of a social scientist, it was very hard in those studies to understand how social environments might actually influence the relationship between genes and a behavior like education, okay, or an outcome like education. And that's, social scientists, we're really interested in, okay? So, if I'm gonna put up my assumptions here, yeah, I think genes matter, okay? But I also think that they matter differently depending on social environments. So I'm gonna try to talk you through this, and please stop me if it's not clear. But the gist of what I'm showing you here is that there is, the studies that have come out using data like WLS have been able to come up with like a score, basically. So it's a list or a summary of all these different genetic variants. And so each individual has one of those summary measures, okay? And it's all the genetic variants. And individuals with certain scores are more likely to attain higher educational attainment than other individuals. Okay, so it does a pretty good job at this point explaining about somewhere just under 10% of the variation in educational attainment. So it does a decent job. That's a pretty small fraction of variation still, 10%, but it's telling us that genes matter. Now, what we were interested in, though, again, was how social conditions matter, though. So the easiest and simplest way to do this, actually, was to look at differences between men and women. So I'm going to walk you through this. The idea here is, okay, that what we see is that the relationship between genetics, basically, and educational attainment in this sample were stronger for men than for women. And the reason why, or the reason we believe why, and there's some other studies to kind of back this up, the reason why we think that this is true is because whatever sort of, if you want to talk about it as sort of genetic advantage or genetic potential that women had, was in essence sort of inhibited by social conditions at the time. Or it depends on how you want to think about it, but it was altered. That's a normative term, I guess, inhibited. But it was altered, right? Like the social environment at the time, expectations were different for this cohort of women about whether or not, for example, they should go on and obtain a college degree. Now, without getting into the details of it, though, it gets really interesting, because a lot of this women in this cohort went back to college. So in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, a lot of women went back. So times were changing. And in general, more women were going to school, and you absolutely saw within this cohort, way more women in their 40s and 50s were going back and getting more schooling beyond high school, for example, than more men in this cohort. And you did see that this educational polygenic risk score, or this sort of genetics, basically, you did really see that play out as well in terms of, for women at this point, predicting who was a little bit more likely to go back than others. Now, I want to be really careful here, right? Because I don't want to overstate genetics matter. I'm still going to argue that based on what we know across a wide array of findings about what determines educational attainment, it's a pretty small fraction. But one of the incredible values of a project like WLS is that we're able to say, not just, yes, okay, fine, genes matter, but we're also able to use these data to understand how environment moderates the influence of those genes. It either can enhance it and make these genetic effects stronger, and in some cases it can weaken it and make genetic effects weaker. So that's one example. How many folks in this room have heard much about the gut microbiome, just out of curiosity? Okay, yeah. So very briefly here, because I'm getting close to the end of my, I don't want to overdo my time here. We I started a collaboration with a bacteriologist on campus, a guy by the name of Federico Ray, who's in our Department of Bacteriology here, to study the gut microbiome. Now, the gut microbiome is sometimes referred to as the other genome, but the idea behind it is that you have trillions of microbes that live on you and within you, especially in your gut. And these microbes have a really strong influence on a range of different kind of health outcomes. So think about it in a very specific way. You've got trillions of microbes in your gut, right? The microbes in your gut, one of the things that they're doing, for example, is processing the food that you eat, okay? It influences your immune system and the development of your immune system, because when you're born, essentially, there are no microbes in your gut. You acquire that gut microbiome in the first 3 years of your life. So all those little microbes, like starting to colonize your gut, actually then in turn influence how your immune system develops, okay? So there's a lot of interest in the gut microbiome at this point. And the advantage to including it in WLS is essentially one of the reasons why the gut microbiome is actually so different than the genome. Now, I've already made the case that the genome, you can't think about the effect of genetics on any kind of outcome without thinking about the context, right? So in that case, I was giving you an example of gender. But even more so, the gut microbiome, or the microbiome, is so strongly a function of environment. It really, really is. Genetics plays a little bit of a role. There's some evidence that it plays a little bit of a role, but it's largely a function of environment. It's a function of where you live. It's a function of what you eat. And one of the things that we're finding in our project is that it may be even, or probably is, a function of who you interact with and how you interact with your spouse, for example. So this has been really, really fun. And here I also want to go back to the survey part and talk about, again, the sort of innovations and things that we've been able to do that you just wouldn't have been able to do 10 years ago. So I gave you the example of the saliva samples. What was innovative there in terms of in prior years, they came up with a mechanism basically to just store saliva. So you didn't have to keep it cold or freeze it right away, right? So if you're mailing out saliva sample collection kits to 6,000, 7,000 people, it's just not practical to figure out how to keep it refrigerated. Well, they developed these technologies that made it easy to do that. You didn't need to refrigerate it until we got it back, so on and so forth. The gut microbiome, and I really wanted to highlight it here, is to talk about some of the innovation here at UW. So we are the first big project like this to try to collect data on the gut microbiome. The way that we had to do that was actually to collect fecal samples. That sink in. So we've a lot of surveys now ask for a lot of things from people. They ask for saliva. They ask for blood, skin, hair. You would be amazed at the things that they ask. No one, though, had gone quite as far as to try to ask people for some fecal samples, but we did. And one of the things about doing this, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of it, but just a shout out here. So the UW Survey Center is our survey center on campus. They run a lot of different projects, not just WLS, but they had to develop a whole way of thinking about how do you do this? One, how do you ask people for this? How are you sure that you're clear with people about what you're doing and why you're doing it? To the actual sample collection protocol, okay? How to do it in a way that those samples would be viable for us to actually do this assay here and figure out which little microbes are in people's guts. And so we were the first project to do it. Some projects in the past few years are starting to try to do it now. But that's a really another nice example of kind of the innovation that occurred right here at UW-Madison, and I really want to be sure to highlight the Survey Center. Okay. This is just a study. There were a couple of news media accounts that came out. And I'm happy to talk more about some of the findings we've had from so far from this project in Q&A if you want. But I actually wanted to close with some of, in the last survey, we asked people to kind of give some advice, essentially, advice to people younger than themselves, basically. What sage advice that they have? So I'm pulling out some things that I thought were particularly sage, I suppose. And also I sort of thought, yeah, I'd tell my kids this. So I'm just gonna pull out some of the things that our participants offered us. This is advice I keep trying to give my husband. He's on Twitter all the time. Don't think that you know it all. Listen to your parents, listen to your educators. Above all, be honest and trust in God. And if I learned anything, it was not to give advice. I think that was my favorite. All right, so I'll stop there, but I'm happy to take some additional questions. Hi.
As I think about UW-Wisconsin, I think about the cross-disciplinary connections that are made here. I'm a member of a faculty, but I was also an undergraduate student here, and in both contexts, there was a lot of interaction. Now you've got social scientists collecting and processing fecal samples, in collaboration. Do you think also that the collaborative nature of the work that's done on this campus is particularly striking compared to other places, or really is it pretty much the way that science and social science is being done everywhere?
That's a great question. So I would say, the questioner was asking, the extent to which and this is very true on the UW campus, the kinds of things I'm talking about, right? Like I'm a sociologist by training with a heavy emphasis in policy, but here I am collaborating with a bacteriologist. How typical is that, right? So at Wisconsin, this kind of collaboration is very typical. It is not so typical at other universities. It's a lot harder. It's going on, and so you see this kind of interdisciplinary collaboration going on at other universities. So for example, I've spent time at UT Austin, I spent time at the University of Michigan, and both of those places, certainly that kind of work was going on, but there is something really different here, and I can't quite describe how or why, but it's just so easy to get to know people across campus here in a way that I have not found at other universities. So in university speak, they talk about silos, and so you stick in your disciplinary silo, you only hang out with the sociologists or you only hang out with the social scientists. It just doesn't work that way here. And it's one of the reasons why I really, really love being here. But what I would say is that it is a real strength here in the broader sense, in that there is an expectation, for example, from the National Institutes for Health, and I think just generally the kind of innovations we're seeing in science at this point, that you need these collaborations. Right? Like you need these collaborations. If we're going to really understand, for example, how the gut microbiome, or if we're going to really understand how social environments influence the composition of the gut microbiome, you kind of want people involved who have expertise in studying social environments, right? So that would be one example, yeah. And by the same token, all this work on genetics, for example, it's not like you should let a social scientist loose with genetic data without expertise, right? So I mean it both ways,
Yes, you made a point early on about the degree to which you could rely on people to continue to participate in these surveys. And your talk has the title Wisconsin Idea in it. Do you think that in other states you would have had the same sort of loyalty among participants, or is there something unique about the way this was done that developed that loyalty among the citizens who are now providing pretty intimate data about themselves?
You guys are asking the best questions. I feel like and I'm not kidding about this, I feel like I planted these. That's a really, really good question. So I'll sort of step back and say broadly, there is this real concern with, I think you'd be surprised to learn the extent to which we rely on survey research kind of for everything, right? The census is survey research. We really rely on the census to understand everything from how we give out federal money to businesses. Businesses rely actually heavily, the private sector relies heavily on the census to try to even figure out where to locate things. And there is this real problem that it's getting harder and harder to get people to answer surveys. But yes, Wisconsin is really, our sample is unusual, and we're sort of known for it. We're known for having a really, really high kind of what we call a response rate. So the fact that the same people have basically been participating in the study for all these years. Now, what's going on? Why is that? Why are people more willing here than in other places? Well, to some extent, I want to emphasize the degree to which kind of survey methods and expertise matter. So you just don't do this in a haphazard way. So our survey center on campus is really good at their job, and there's a lot of people, like some people actually do this for a living, like people are survey methodologists, like that's their whole, like that's what they do for a living. And we have a lot of really good ones at UW Survey Center. So there's some just general expertise that we've learned from them. But I think generally, a big thing is about building relationships over time, or it seems to be the case that that we've built relationships with people over the course of their lives, and it makes them generally more likely to want to participate and to continue to participate in the project. I mean, we've had some really, really fun things, like around the 50th high school reunions. This was actually just before I took over the project. I went around to a lot of different high school reunions around the state, as did other members of our team, to talk to people about findings from the project. And so the sort of ongoing relationships I do think matter. And I would like to say, I mean, maybe I'm being sentimental here, but like I would like to say that I do think that there's probably something in the water in Wisconsin that makes people a little bit more willing to give in this way.
So I'm curious as to whether during the course of these people's lives there was any personality profiling, ever Myers-Briggs or anything like that administered on them?
Yeah, so we asked people in their 50s, in their 60s, and then again their 70s, something called it's a personality scale. So it's called the Big Five. So it's meant to capture openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And that's very standard in psychological work. And so one of the studies, actually, I pointed to the one about earnings. That was agreeableness was basically one of those items, and what people did find a relationship with earnings. The strongest findings you get actually from personality, though, interestingly enough, I think, at least in terms of health, is that people who end up slightly higher on neuroticism scales, this is not good news for me, I have to say, tend to be a little bit sicker over time, for example, or tend to be slightly poor health. It's like an indicator of a slightly lower well-being. But there also has been interest in how people's personality changes as they age, and personality does change as people age. Actually, people become slightly more agreeable over time, despite the stereotypes. For example. But you see similar levels. What doesn't appear to change, at least, is that this sort of distribution kind of stays the same. Do you know what I mean? So like, relative to other people, people tend to stay in similar places, but yeah.
You said one of your 3 goals was to help us understand your approach in methodology research. And this isn't your research, but it is going on at the university. I read an article in Isthmus recently about Madison having a new research center on transgender. And they used a term that I was not familiar with at all, and I would like some help understanding it. They used the term affirmative research. And then they went on to describe it by, the reporter said, well, if you're doing affirmative research, aren't you worried about people perceiving you as being biased? And the person who runs the research center said, no, all people are biased anyway, and if we are transparent about our biases, then that's what matters. And I learned research at the UW, and that wasn't what I was taught, so I got really confused. And then I would also like you to speak to what you think the appropriate role of activism is in a research foundation. Thank you.
Yeah, those are really big questions, and I mean that sincerely. So there is sort of a longstanding debate about objectivity in research, or the degree to which one can truly sort of walk away from your assumptions about the world in terms of how it shapes your research. What I would sort of say is the model of this project is definitely more of the traditional kind of objective. Like, we're really, so, you know, I made the joke earlier about sort of saying, oh, you should all report that your health is excellent. Like, that was bad. I never should have done that. In part because we're actually quite serious as survey researchers. Like, we're super careful. So we're careful, for example, with how we order questions, how we ask questions, that we're not biasing. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but like, you'll see this sometimes with public opinion polling. You know, people will ask like leading questions that will get them, you know, you'll get people more likely. So that's something, so that's sort of this model. I can't really speak to I'm not sure I can speak so much to that broader debate, other than to say, you know, again, that's like our model is a somewhat more traditional model. In terms of activism, I mean, you know, it's tricky. So here's what I would say, which is that I don't conduct science so it will exist in a vacuum, right? Like, I don't do this just so it can sit on a shelf. So I certainly feel pretty strongly that, you know, you want your research out there. You know, whether I use this particular research to, for example, to advocate a particular policy, that's not something I exactly do. I do have work on Social Security, but I'm sorry, I'm fumbling around here. I guess what I would say, here's what I would say. Actually, this is what I say to my policy analysis students. You know, I think my way of approaching the world, and I think actually this is very common around campus, is I live in an evidence-based world. And so I might say, look, policy X is going to be better than policy Y on dimension A. Like, it'll get you here on dimension A. But on dimension B, might not turn out so well for you. Like, my job, I do feel like, so I'm going to just move away from the word activism and just sort of say how I think about this, is to present evidence that we've spent, you know, our whole careers kind of building and collecting. And I do hope that gets used in policy discussions. But that's sort of how I think about it. I collect evidence. That I work really hard to make sure is accurate, and then I want it used in policy debates. And I may offer my opinion periodically about how to interpret the evidence, but does that help? Yeah, okay. Okay, 2 more questions, I guess. There's someone directing me here, so. Yes.
My question is somewhat related to the last question, but I wanted to know, is there a way to gauge whether just participation in your survey of your random sample
It's truly random.
will then later influence their life decisions? For example, what comes to mind really are the women who go back to school, because if you're exposed to a whole list of options and then you think, oh, well, I was just going to have children, but now maybe I should go to school. I mean, is there a way to gauge that, whether you might have actually influenced these people's decisions?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So there's a growing body of work on this, actually, to try to understand whether the actual process of interviewing people has then any implications in terms of potentially influencing what they do. So there are a range of different ways people explore that, but it's still kind of, that work is kind of in its infancy, and in part because, you know, studies like WLS, this was one of the first of its kind. So projects like WLS, where you've been tracking people over their whole lives, are still somewhat unusual. Now, we have a lot of studies coming up behind us. And so those sorts of questions now are getting put on the table. And what I would say is there's some evidence maybe in some domains that it might influence, but it's still really, really open area of research. And actually, there's someone on the WLS team, a guy, Rob Warren, if you're interested, a guy, Rob Warren, who's at the University of Minnesota, though he was trained here, who's doing a lot of work in this area and is really interested in those kinds of effects. So if you want to Google Rob Warren at Minnesota Sociology, you could find some interesting work on the topic.
Also related to data interpretation, could you comment on the components of racial and ethnicity in your sample?
Yeah, so we have very little racial or ethnic, we have very little racial variation in the sample. So in part because of this was a function of the particular cohort and the fact that they're high school graduates, we have a limited amount of racial variation in the sample. The ethnic variation is sort of the difference between Germans and Swedes and Poles. And what am I forgetting? Germans, Swedes, Poles, and Norwegians. Yep, thank you. Thank you. Yes, but no, that is not a front where we shine in terms of our ability to kind of answer questions around those issues. Oh, I'm sorry. That was... Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed this.